thank you very much, Professor Bendel. It's really a delight to be here. In a way, I feel like I'm in two places at a time. The city of Erlangen and here at the university, which is so known for its track record in the field of human rights and for the Human Rights Center and for the wonderful research that's done and for the very good students it has. And then also in the city of Nuremberg, which of course has really for many, many years manifested itself and worked on the idea of being a human rights city. And when I was flying here this morning, I was thinking about how many markers in the field of international law are actually named after cities. You have the Nuremberg Charter, you have the Treaty of Maastricht, you have the San Francisco Charter, there's many other examples. And the Treaty of Utrecht, I didn't want to be too much patriotic in that regard now that we're not at the World Championship. No, I won't talk about the World Championship here. Anyway, yes, Treaty of Utrecht is also a very good example. Yet, as Marcus Krajewski very rightfully mentioned, when we think about international law, when we think about human rights, we always focus on states. And I think a key thread in my presentation today will be the need to really think through the role of cities in furthering and implementing international human rights law, also from a legal perspective. Well, the occasion for talking about this has, I think, already very well been set out by my predecessors. I too was struck by the example of the Aquarius a few weeks ago and by the contrast between the Italian position and that of a number of cities. One of those cities was Barcelona. Here you see the mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, who stands here at the opening of a shame counter. I don't know if anyone has seen this in Barcelona. In Barcelona they have you can say it's a work of art, you can say it's a digital manifest, but they have a statue that counts the amount of people who died crossing the Mediterranean in the current year. And in a way, this is a reminder to the people of Barcelona of the drama happening as we speak on the Mediterranean, but also of what is felt as a urban responsibility to address the consequences of migration. So this is one example, but you see examples like that all over the world. Another one which some of you might have been following is the rise of sanctuary cities in the United States. Again, you have the example of a national government that's becoming more and more conservative with very strict immigration policies. And this is coupled to a situation in which more and more cities, but also counties and also states in the US manifest themselves as sanctuary cities. Now, in the US context, being a sanctuary city means that cities don't cooperate fully with the federal deportation agency, and that when they arrest someone, they have the option of detaining that person for the person to be deported if it concerns an irregular migrant. And these are all cities, counties, and states that refuse to do that, and in that sense also really decouple their local policies from national migration policies. Well, another instance, a much broader one, was already hinted upon by Marcus Krajewski. It's the rise worldwide of human rights cities. A few years ago, we wrote a book about this with a number of colleagues, and I was personally struck by the amount of cities all over the world that somehow take international law, international human rights law, as a basis for their local policies. And this can be in the field of women's rights, it can be in the field of children's rights, it can be in the field of human rights generally. But you also increasingly see this in the field of migration and refugee rights. So, for instance, the World Forum of Human Rights Cities, which meets in Gwangju later this year, will really have as a theme the refugee rights and the rights of migrants more generally. So the theme of today is indeed the the increasing role played by cities in refugee rights in particular, in human rights in general. And what I'd like to contribute to the discussion is first a bit of background on the topic, asking the question why we see this development happening, to then, on the basis of our research up to now, theorize a bit on why it is that some cities are more welcoming than others. What are explanatory factors there? How do local settings matter? And I want to focus on a number of elements which I thought would be interesting for our dialogue today, because they correspond so well with the really interesting research here. I'd then want to make the case that what we are seeing is not so much a local turn, but a global turn in a way, mixing the global and the local, and then return, as someone who combines a legal and a political science background, return to the role of international law and in these discussions. So that's the agenda. But before turning to local settings, it might be good to briefly look at what aspects of refugee reception and integration we're actually talking about, and why it is that cities play such a role there. Well, just briefly, the big picture, our world today. Of course, there is the influx of refugees. In Europe, nowhere as large as in other parts of the world. I think it's always important to mention that. Outside of the EU, in Turkey, there's 3.5 million Syrians. Lebanon has seen its population double over the past years because of the war in Syria, in Jordan, in Kenya. There's an enormous amount of refugees, but also in Europe we have witnessed a significant influx of people fleeing for their life. At the same time, in terms of the political context, we see a rise of multi-level governance. This has also already been touched upon. Another aspect brought to the fore by scholars like Benjamin Barber is, in a way, the inability of the nation state to address the big challenges of today. We talk about migration now, but the same goes for climate change. You see national politics increasingly deadlocked, unable to take real steps forward, and this is also part of the context. Another part of the political institutional context to look at, I think, is the rise of network societies, the fact that this idea of a world of nation states maybe was never a depiction of the reality, but is most definitely not a depiction of today's political reality. And at the same time, in thinking about cities, it seems important to understand the degree to which key competences in the fields we're talking about have been decentralized to local authorities all over Europe in the past decades. And of course, there's big differences between decentral countries like Germany and centralist countries like the Netherlands. But this process of decentralization you've seen everywhere. So this is, I think, a cluster of background elements to take into account in understanding, in analyzing what we see happening. Another cluster of policy measures, wider tendencies that explain to a large extent what we see and why we see it, has to do with neoliberalism, has to do with austerity politics, and has to do with technocratization. If you look at a detailed level in what happens in cities and why it happens with refugees, there's always this big thing of neoliberalism as an explanatory factor. Now, another set of background tendencies, I think, to look at, to consider in understanding also why it is mayors that are suddenly coming to the fore in thinking about migration, is the rise of populism. And populism here, I mean the idea that it's very important to listen to the majority of the people, to follow the wishes of the majority. This also explains, I think, to a large extent, the measures we see in migration management these days. Another aspect is the rise of the personal in politics. I don't know what it was like in Germany 20 years ago and how it compares to today, but all over Europe you see a rise of the importance of mayors as individuals. And to me this has everything to do with the fact that people in these volatile times, uncertain times, want individuals they can relate to, and individuals can really impress upon local politics. Symbolic politics also serve as background explanations, and I think in analyzing these developments, the role of social media is also something really important for us as researchers also to take into account. So this in a way is the big canvas on which we see the rise of local authorities in refugee reception and integration. And what now are the particular domains in which you see cities taking a larger stance than before, differing from one another? Well, I've listed some of them here together with the Cities of Refuge team. You see differences, for instance, in the field of reception. Again, this differs per country. For instance, in Switzerland, cantons have a wide range of competencies, really also in determining refugee status. But you see differences also, for instance, in the Netherlands, where there's some municipalities that, for instance, say we won't send people back to Afghanistan. It might be national policy, it might be the policy of our immigration authorities, but we feel Afghanistan is not safe enough, and we're not doing everything we can to ensure people don't go back. So that's really in the field of status determination. You see differences in the field of housing, in the field of what is provided in terms of services for people. You see big differences in terms of education. For instance, the question as to whether someone who arrives in a given city can immediately start studying, start learning the language, or has to wait for status determination. Big differences between countries, but also big differences within countries throughout Europe. The same in the field of healthcare. The same if you look at psychological support. Over the past half year, we did research in the rural area in which I live, called Zeeland, in the southwest of the Netherlands. And there you see the amount of resources that people get to work with traumas, the degree to which there are these type of services really differs from municipality to municipality. So there too you see differences. I know there's people here who are working on mobility, the freedom of movement. Again, there you see some municipalities who really restrict people in reception centers whilst they're waiting for status determination, and others who have as a policy to mix people much more than that. And another in the reception phase is whether people are allowed to work immediately or whether they have to wait for status determination. So in all these fields you see cities differ from one another even before someone who's applying for a refugee status receives that status. Well, of course, in the much more long-term, difficult, intricate process of integration, you also see big differences between cities, whether it's about family reunification policies, the type of housing that people get, whether people are really put together or spread out over a town, the quality of access to housing, quality of social services, education, the type of language courses. To give the example of the Netherlands, again, because of neoliberal thinking, because of market thinking, integration and language acquisition in the Netherlands is considered the individual responsibility of refugees. This means that people have to buy their own courses, their own language training, and the quality of what's offered really, really differs from one municipality to another. So there you see big differences. In the Netherlands, again, we now have something called a participation declaration that people have to sign. There's courses for this. Municipalities have the competence to design courses. And this means that one municipality will focus on where do you put your garbage? How do you phone a doctor if you have a problem? And another municipality will really develop a course on Dutch values and what they entail. So also very big differences. You see the same in Denmark, for instance. Same in the field of labor markets, integration and naturalization. So there's a whole range of policy domains, often directly the competence of local authority, that really determine how someone fleeing their country is welcomed, is integrated, the quality of the process, that's completely within the domain of local authorities, and where local authorities throughout Europe really differ in what they do. A key puzzle is, of course, why is it that they differ? Why is one city a city of refuge, if you want to label it that way, and why do other cities really find mayors standing on the barricades to keep people out? Well, of course, this is a big issue and a complex issue with an enormous amount of factors involved, and I won't go by all of them, but my colleague Timur Sabchev has really set out the different domains of explanation, if you wish, why cities diverge. Part of it is the institutional opportunity structure. In the project on mayors and migration policies, you're going to look at the amount of autonomy that local authorities have. And of course, this is a key factor in explaining why some cities do much more than others, also if you compare countries to one another. There's policy opportunities. Politics play a big role. An interesting thing is that people always think, oh, left-wing cities are so much more open than more right-wing cities. Well, as an overarching finding, this is true, But there's also very notable exceptions. You have in Belgium, for instance, the city of Mechelen, which has a relatively right-wing mayor, someone who very much has a law and order agenda, very tough on crime, Bart Somers, but who also has really opened up the city for refugees. So you do see exceptions to this political thesis. Another aspect that I want to say a bit about more later is the role of cities in networks. So this is all in the field of institutional opportunity structures. At the same time, in understanding why cities differ from one another, it's really important to look at the complex of actors. When I started this project on Cities of Refuge, I had the concept of local government in the research question, and by now I've come to realize that you should not speak of local government, it's really local governance. It's about the complex of actors, it's about civil society, it's about businesses being involved. There's interesting examples like Milan and Torino in Italy, where the involvement of big business really explains why the city is relatively welcoming. And there's also a key role for individuals. That's something I want to focus on a bit more later. In looking at other, say, background variables, there's a host of research more from geography, from urban studies, that points out that, of course, the wealth of a city matters. It's much easier to be welcoming if you have a lot of funds to do that. The labor market conditions matter. If you really need people to work in your companies, then you'll often find big business also on your side in being welcoming. The housing market matters. It can be that if there's all these empty buildings, it might be really attractive to fill them with people seeking housing. You see this a lot in Italy, you see it in rural areas in the Scandinavian countries, you see it in rural areas in the Netherlands. And of course the availability of services is also an explanatory factor there. Another aspect that doesn't get that much attention in the literature, but that I also want to say something about a bit later, is the role of discourse and narratives, and the way in which the need to be welcoming or the need to not be as welcoming is phrased discursively, because I think it's really important in Europe today, and not looked at as much as I think is necessary. First, city networks. I won't say much about that, apart from the fact that I'm really looking forward to learning about the results of the project. In our project on cities and refugees, one of the things we came to realize is how being in a network makes a difference for a city in terms of getting in funding, in terms of other aspects that I'll touch upon later. We did an analysis of these city networks in Europe, a bit different because we looked at networks of which European cities were part, so also more international networks, also the Council of Europe. There you see that you have 27 networks which comply with this definition, and that in a way there's a lot of overlap. There are cities that are a member of a lot of different networks. So for instance, Barcelona is a member of 9 of these 27 networks, which also makes for interesting theorizing. Why is it that there's a need for all these different networks? What does that mean? But networks are clearly a key issue to focus on, which is, I think, why it's so good that this project is starting here. In our analysis of what these networks are, what they do, we distinguished a number of functions. One is simply sharing information. How do you house people? How do you make sure that people who lived in town already don't feel left out, exchange of best practices. Another key function already mentioned is looking for international support, funding European projects, international projects, but also recognition of what cities do. Another, and this is very much the narrative component again, is about testing which narratives, which stories about refugees work best, also politically. I remember interviewing an elder woman in Antwerp who very much has a human rights background, and she said to me, well, if I start talking about human rights in our municipal council, I won't get anywhere in terms of refugee reception. I really have to find a story that connects to the history of Antwerp, that connects to the economic agenda, and these types of stories is also stories that travel between cities. Another key function is setting standards, agreeing on joint standards. You have, for instance, the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism, ECAR. They have a 10-point plan which you commit to as a city, and once you commit to it, you also keep to following those standards. If you look at what city networks do, it's also very much about showing what is done in cities, showcasing in a way. More cynical people speak about city branding. This is very much there in what cities do, manifesting a city as a cosmopolitan city, also in the international plane for a wide variety of reasons. And another aspect very much related to what we were discussing before is this idea of also teaming up with cities transnationally, with international actors to shame governments and to point out that there are alternatives to more restrictive national governmental policies. And if you look at all these functions, and I'll come back to that later, you can say that these transnational networks, in a way, are really global networks. They serve to translate global norms to the local, to help develop global norms, and this is how they work in the field of refugee reception and integration. Okay, so this is one aspect to look at, and very much the agenda here in Erlangen for the coming years, and I'll be really interested to read what comes out and to discuss what comes out. As said, one of the things I've come to realize in studying what happens in different municipalities is that you can't speak about government alone. You have to speak about governance, and in a way that this idea of a local turn could also be misleading because of the multi-level context in which these processes take place. I mean, the fact that in Italy, in status determination, you have a committee that sits in a locality, but that has someone of the municipality, that has someone of the UNHCR, that has someone of the prefettura, which is very much the central agency locally, and an expert, and that this joint committee decides whether you get a refugee status or not. How to make sense of that without taking into account this governance assemblage, if you wish, involved in these processes. So I think this is very much also for us trying to understand what cities do, why they do it, something to keep in mind. One of the things that I find really interesting, and why I look forward to also the mayor's speech a bit later, is the role of individuals. If you look at why one city does so much more than others, and you really start asking and looking around, you often end up with one person. You end up with one very enthusiastic civil servant, you end up with a university professor, you end up with an active mayor, you end up with someone in civil society. Often you end up with a combination of those people who know each other. But it's often really the work of individuals that makes why one city is a really good place to arrive and why another city is much less welcoming. And I've pasted here just one example quoted within the Eurocities context, but to me that example stands for the role of individuals in these large and to some extent also intractable processes. Okay, so that's about the actor setting, if you wish. As said, I feel it's also really important to look at discourses of reception, discourses of integration. Our colleague Sarah Millet has just written a really interesting paper about, with as a title, Burden or Benefit, Duty or Gift, in which she analyzes the types of discourses pertaining to refugee reception and integration. And if you look at these discourses, you see that they switch over time. They're very different. You have very negative discourses. For instance, in Italy, increasingly you see the arrival of migrants framed as a health risk. So this is like people are coming here and they can be carrying all kinds of diseases with them, and this is why we as a city shouldn't take them in. So really a public health kind of narrative. On the other hand, you have narratives relating to tradition, which go both ways. So on the one hand, it can be like, look, we are Bavarian, or we're Frisian, or we're Danish, or even a sub-national identity, and this is our identity, and people simply don't fit in here. On the other hand, you see very powerful narratives which go back to the city history. So for instance, Mechelen, again, this mayor of Mechelen really describes how Mechelen was the first place to have a high court for the whole region, also the Netherlands and what's now the Netherlands and what's now France. How there's this tradition of international law, if you wish, in Mechelen. How Mechelen also has a black page in its history because it was the place where Jews were deported during the war, and how because of this tradition it's important to receive people. And of course, this is very much what you see in Nuremberg as well, this relating to the tradition of a town, which is a very powerful narrative, and at times even more powerful than saying, well, these are people, they have rights, we signed and ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Refugees and a whole host of human rights conventions. Sometimes framing things in terms of tradition works better, but of course every type of discourse also has a trade-off to it. For instance, what you see a lot also all over Europe is the emphasis on the economic value of refugees. Like, we have jobs, we need people to work here, many people are highly educated, they should be integrated into our labor market. Well, this is a discourse that works to some extent. At the same time, how do you then relate to people who are too old or too disabled or illiterate and cannot work? Do they then not benefit from the welcoming attitude? So looking at discourses and critically analyzing them, I think, is also an important part of understanding what cities do and why cities do it. Anyway, so this is a big tour d'horizon on explaining what cities do, why they do it. As said, I'd like to zoom in on this idea of glocalism and glocal developments. So as an interim conclusion, I think we can say that local authorities are more and more taking a role in both creating human rights, really talking along at the international level, but also very much in realizing refugee rights and human rights more generally. Human rights can be invoked in these processes, sometimes legally, sometimes discursively, sometimes just by cities complying with international human rights obligations. But a kind of legal puzzle that I wanted to put to this audience, just because I'd be really interested in your thoughts on it, is what in this context do we see as the formal autonomous position of cities in realizing international human rights law? And let me first explain why I think this is important to think about. It's already been mentioned a number of times that in the perception of international lawyers, international law is a state affair. States are actors in international law. They enter into obligations in a contractual way. These are human rights covenants, and how they then organize things nationally is really very much a state affair and not something that is of concern to international law. But what we see happening increasingly is a situation where local authorities decouple their local policies from national policies and invoke international legal obligations to do so. You see this in refugee reception, but you also see this where it concerns irregular migrants, and that's an example that I'd like to put on the table. Of course, there's a big difference between people seeking refuge, people receiving refugee status, and people who, for instance, flee their country and are not recognized as refugees under the Refugee Convention. Let me describe the puzzle by focusing on a Dutch case. The Dutch case is that of undocumented migrants in the Netherlands, where we, for a number of years now, since 2012, have a government that has as a formal position that people who've applied for refugee status and have been declined such status do not have the right to, for instance, emergency shelter. So the idea is people should leave the country and shouldn't be given any form of assistance apart from primary education and emergency health care, but definitely not shelter. Of course, we all know that there is a group of people who might formally have to leave, but who can't go back to their own country because their own country doesn't want them back, because psychologically they can't do it, because they don't have, they're stateless, they don't have a passport. There's many reasons why people feel compelled to stay in an arrival country and also in a given city. And because mayors and cities are much closer to this problem, you've seen cities over the Netherlands saying, well, we are going to provide what's called bed, bad, brood in the Netherlands, bed, bath and bread. We're going to provide emergency shelter to these migrants. Well, this is a very much a politicized issue. The need for the Dutch government to do this was taken up to Strasbourg, to the committee looking into the implementation of the European Social Charter. And this Strasbourg committee said, well, the Netherlands has to do this, and if the state of the Netherlands doesn't do it, cities have to do it. At the same time, for instance, a number of UN special rapporteurs also made similar comments. So they said there's an international human rights obligation to provide these people with shelter. Well, the Dutch state says, well, we're not going to do it. We see things differently. But what you see now is local authorities like Utrecht, like Amsterdam, like Rotterdam, like Groningen, invoking international human rights law and saying, well, we are complying with international human rights law and doing what Strasbourg and the UN want us to do. So you, in a way, have local authorities invoking international law vis-à-vis national states. And I think this is the reason why it's worthwhile to also think about these processes legally. Clearly, this is very much a developing discussion, definitely in the field of international law. But what you see in international human rights law, for instance, is that there's increased interest in this theme. So the UN Human Rights Council has asked for a report on this issue and adopted that report in 2015 on the human rights obligations of local authorities. There will be a continued discussion on this and possibly even the guidelines presented at the UN General Assembly and at the next Human Rights Council meeting. And in the interim, what you see is, for instance, a lot of UN special rapporteurs really speaking directly to cities on their obligations, for instance, for the right to housing, which is clearly often a local government competency. You see the same within the context of UN Habitat, where, again, cities are very active also in talking along, in lobbying also for the development of standards. For instance, a standard like the right to the city. If you look at Europe, not so much in the sense of the EU, but in the sense of the Council of Europe, you see that the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities has been really active again in the past years in explicating the responsibilities of local authorities. And also in developing indicators, human rights indicators for local authorities. So they've recently issued a report in this field. Finally, if you talk about the EU, of course, this is a very different legal order, but here too one could argue on the basis of EU law that there is an autonomous obligation, even stronger than in international law, for local authorities to comply directly with EU directives. Those of you with an interest in EU law will know about the Costanzo obligation and the obligation of local authorities to comply with EU directives even if national governments don't do so. And this arguably also applies to directives like the Qualifications Directive, like the Returns Directive, like EU law that sets out the fundamental rights of refugees and migrants. Well, again, this is a field that's very much in development. I'm really thrilled that the International Law Association has now set up a committee to look into the responsibilities of cities in this field, and has started thinking about what it means to not only see cities as kind of actors in this black box of the state, but to also see them as actors in their own right. Of course, there's very big normative questions involved, because how do you normatively evaluate the fact that one city might be much more welcoming than another, might take obligations much more seriously than another? One thing there is to say about this, and this is something Moritz Baumgärtel and I argue in an article that's coming out in the European Journal of International Law this summer, is that the involvement of cities also adds legitimacy to the field of international human rights law, which is very much questioned because of this idea of being top-down impositions from Geneva and from New York. The moment that you have cities really taking up responsibilities in this field, this also adds to both legitimacy and both to the realization of human rights law. So anyway, that's the legal puzzle that I wanted to put to you. It's a puzzle that shows, again, the global dimensions of the process. It's a puzzle that I haven't solved yet, which is why I thought I'll put it to the human rights minds in Erlangen. But to just conclude the main points that I wanted to share with you today, I think it's safe to say that you see all over Europe and also in other parts of the world a rise of local authorities in realizing refugee rights. This can be explained by a number of factors. City networks are very important, individuals are very important, discourses are important in the research, but that also from the perspective of law, it is important to really think through the role of cities in the field of international law and the relevance of constitutional dispensations in what cities do and cannot do. So with these thoughts, I'd like to thank you for your attention in spite of all the sound outside, and I really look forward to discussing these themes with all of you. Thank you.